What if I told you one movie's budget was so insane it practically murdered an entire Hollywood studio? Forget Marvel's billions. In 1963, the industry was bleeding cash, and nobody was safe. From legendary actors humiliating themselves to directors destroying their careers overnight, this was the year of epic failures. We aren't just talking about flops. We are talking about cinematic catastrophes that nearly ended Hollywood as we knew it. Welcome to the 18 worst box office disasters of 1963. Number 19. The Terror, 1963. We begin at the absolute bottom, with a movie so cheap and chaotic, it became an infamous legend. The Terror is a bizarre, low-budget horror film starring a young Jack Nicholson as a lost French officer. What is happening in the movie is a completely nonsensical mystery. Nicholson wanders onto a creepy coastline and into a dark castle ruled by a strange baron, played by Boris Karloff. Inside, he is haunted by a beautiful, spectral woman who appears in the halls, and he becomes determined to find out who she is and why she is trapped there. The most famous scene takes place in the damp, shadowy cellar of the castle. Nicholson's character is exploring the dark room when the loose floorboards suddenly give way beneath his feet. He plunges into the freezing, flooded basement below, thrashing wildly in the dark water while a thick, unnatural fog rolls across the surface. It is meant to be terrifying, but the execution is so clumsy, it just induces laughter. The movie was famously shot without a finished script, with director Roger Corman and a rotating cast of directors making it up as they went along. Despite the presence of Karloff and a future superstar in Nicholson, audiences in 1963 stayed far away from this confusing mess. It was a massive box office disaster for independent theaters, proving that even horror fans have limits when it comes to sloppy, incoherent filmmaking that completely insults their intelligence. Number 18. The Slime People, 1963. We begin at the absolute bottom of the barrel with what might be the cheapest, most laughable movie to hit theaters in 1963. The Slime People is a disastrously bad science fiction film about a television sportscaster who survives an apocalyptic invasion of Los Angeles. What is happening in the movie is completely absurd. A race of scaly, bipedal lizard creatures from the center of the earth have come to the surface, created a massive wall of solid fog around the city, and begun murdering the remaining survivors with primitive spears. The most famous, utterly hilarious scene happens early in the film. As the hero walks down a deserted, foggy Los Angeles street, a slimy monster suddenly pops up out of a standard city sewer grate. The creature is clearly a guy wearing an incredibly cheap, ill-fitting rubber suit that looks like it was bought at a dime store. The monster moves stiffly, like a man tripping over his own feet, completely ruining any sense of danger. The dialogue is atrocious, the acting is amateurish, and the fog machine is so overused you can barely see what is happening. Even teenagers looking for cheap thrills stayed far away from this disaster. It made almost no money and is remembered today only as a legendary example of how unbelievably bad B-movies could get when filmmakers completely stopped caring about quality and just wanted to make a quick, pathetic buck off an unsuspecting public. Number 17. The Old Dark House, 1963. Director William Castle was the king of cheap gimmicks, but this remake completely failed to trick audiences into buying tickets. The Old Dark House is a comedic horror film about an American car salesman who gets trapped in a bizarre Welsh mansion. What is happening in the movie is a twisted, unfunny game of survival. The salesman arrives at the creepy home seeking help for his broken-down car, only to discover the family living there is completely insane and deeply in debt. The family members begin murdering each other off one by one to collect the inheritance, while the terrified American tries desperately to escape the deadly traps hidden throughout the house. The most famous scene happens during a chaotic dinner party. As the family sits around the long, candlelit table arguing, a massive, heavy iron chandelier suddenly breaks free from the ceiling. It crashes down onto the dining table with a deafening smash, narrowly missing the survivors as they dive out of their chairs in a panic. While Castle usually used fun gimmicks like flying skeletons in theaters to sell his movies, this film lacked any compelling hook. The comedy was painfully flat, and the horror was entirely bloodless. It died a quick, miserable death at the box office, serving as a harsh reminder that wrapping a bad script in a spooky setting doesn't guarantee success, leaving audiences completely bored and theaters completely empty. Number 16. The Caretakers, 1963. Hollywood's obsession with heavy psychiatric dramas backfired spectacularly with the release of The Caretakers. The movie takes place inside a chaotic, overcrowded state mental hospital. What is happening in the movie is a bitter, exhausting ideological war. We watch as a tyrannical, old-school head nurse, played by a thoroughly unhinged Joan Crawford, clashes violently with a new, idealistic psychiatrist who wants to introduce modern, compassionate therapy methods for the female patients. The most famous scene happens during a massive, chaotic patient riot in the hospital's recreation room. The women completely lose control, throwing furniture, smashing windows, and screaming uncontrollably. Crawford's character tries to physically restrain a young patient, but the enraged woman turns on her, violently shoving the older nurse to the ground and brutally beating her before order is finally restored. It is a shocking, ugly moment of violence meant to highlight the dangers of underfunded psychiatric care. However, audiences in 1963 found the entire film to be an incredibly unpleasant, hysterical mess. Critics absolutely slaughtered the movie, calling it an exploitative, thinly veiled soap opera that completely mocked the serious subject of mental illness. Despite Crawford's massive fame, the film was a humiliating box office disaster. It proved that audiences had absolutely no desire to sit through 2 hours of screaming, suffering, and clinical misery, especially when the lead character was written as such an irredeemably cruel monster that audiences couldn't possibly sympathize with her outdated, brutal methods. Number 15. The Hook, 1963. Kirk Douglas starred in some of the greatest movies ever made, but The Hook was a grim, claustrophobic disaster that nobody wanted to see. The film takes place entirely over the course of a single, sweltering night in a police precinct in a racially tense neighborhood. What is happening in the movie is a nightmare scenario. A young black man has been arrested for accidentally killing a police officer, and a massive, furious mob of local citizens gathers outside the station, demanding blood and threatening to storm the building. Douglas plays the police captain who is determined to protect the prisoner and uphold the law at any cost. The most famous scene is the climax. Douglas stands at the top of the precinct's stairs, armed only with a shotgun, facing down a stairwell packed with 100 angry, screaming men. It is a tense, visually striking image of one man against the world. However, the film's heavy-handed, preachy dialogue about mob justice and racism felt incredibly dated and superficial. Audiences in 1963 did not want to go to the movies to be lectured about social issues in such a bleak, suffocating environment. It was a box office failure that disappeared from theaters almost immediately, leaving no cultural impact whatsoever today, serving only as a forgotten footnote in the otherwise legendary career of one of Hollywood's toughest leading men. Number 14. The List of Adrian Messenger, 1963. This movie pulled one of the most famously annoying gimmicks in cinematic history, and audiences punished it severely at the box office. The List of Adrian Messenger is a mystery thriller about a retired intelligence officer who discovers that a series of seemingly accidental deaths are actually calculated murders. What is happening in the movie is a methodical, plodding investigation as the officer tries to figure out who is next on the killer's list and why they are being targeted. The entire marketing campaign for the film was built around a massive secret. Several famous Hollywood stars, like Kirk Douglas, Burt Lancaster, and Frank Sinatra, were allegedly hiding in the movie under heavy prosthetic makeup. The most famous scene is the climactic reveal at the very end, where the villain is unmasked. The camera zooms in as the actor peels off a rubber latex face mask, revealing the famous movie star underneath. The gimmick was supposed to be mind-blowing, but audiences just felt ripped off. The disguises were so heavy, and the actor's screen time was so brief, that you could barely tell who they were. The mystery itself was slow and boring. The movie failed commercially, teaching Hollywood a harsh lesson. Tricks don't replace good storytelling, and fooling your audience is a surefire way to lose their hard-earned trust, their money, and their patience for cheap Hollywood parlor tricks that insulted their basic intelligence. Number 13. The Running Man, 1963. Melodrama was a staple of the 1950s, but The Running Man proved audiences were thoroughly sick of it by 1963. The movie follows a desperate young widow who discovers her late husband left behind massive, crippling debts. What is happening in the movie is an exhausting, poorly paced thriller. The widow realizes she cannot pay the bills, so she fakes her own death in a horrific car accident and flees to Spain under a new identity to collect the insurance money. However, a ruthless insurance investigator tracks her down, leading to a tense, uncomfortable game of cat and mouse across the Spanish coast. The most famous scene occurs during a chaotic, crowded bullfight in a Spanish arena. The investigator finally spots the widow in the stands. As the crowd panics and surges because a bull has gotten loose, she tries to flee through the narrow, packed corridors of the stadium, pushing past screaming people while the investigator chases her. It is supposed to be a thrilling, edge-of-your-seat action sequence, but the poor editing and confusing camera work completely ruined the tension. Critics found the plot incredibly contrived, and the romance between the widow and the investigator completely unconvincing. The film was a massive financial flop, failing to attract audiences who were tired of these formulaic, unexciting romantic thrillers that offered nothing new or interesting to watch. Number 12. A New Kind of Love, 1963. On paper, A New Kind of Love looked like a guaranteed hit. It reunited real-life husband and wife Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, two of Hollywood's most respected stars, in what was marketed as a glamorous romantic comedy set against the fashionable backdrop of New York and Paris. Audiences expected sparkling chemistry, witty dialogue, and sophisticated humor. Instead, they received a confusing comedy built on mistaken identities and awkward misunderstandings that struggled to find its audience. The story begins with Samantha Blake, a talented but underappreciated garment district seamstress who works tirelessly designing dresses for wealthy women. One day, she crosses paths with Steve Sherman, a cynical newspaper columnist known for writing sensational stories about high society. After seeing Samantha wearing an elegant designer outfit, Steve mistakenly assumes she is an expensive Parisian escort rather than an ordinary working woman. Instead of correcting him immediately, Samantha decides to play along, believing the deception will teach the arrogant journalist an unforgettable lesson. What follows is a series of increasingly complicated lies as both characters travel to Paris, where every conversation threatens to expose the truth. One of the film's most unusual scenes occurs during Steve's elaborate dream sequence. After falling asleep, he imagines Samantha transforming into legendary women from history, including Eve in the Garden of Eden and Cleopatra seated upon an extravagant golden throne. Each fantasy is filled with oversized costumes, lavish studio sets, exaggerated poses, and theatrical music. Although intended as playful satire, the sequence interrupts the story's momentum and feels strangely disconnected from the romantic plot surrounding it. Number 11. Wives and Lovers, 1963. Hollywood spent much of the late 1950s and early 1960s trying to reinvent the romantic comedy for a more modern audience. But Wives and Lovers proved that simply adding glamorous stars and marital arguments, starring Janet Leigh and Van Johnson. The film explores the fragile relationship between ambition, jealousy, and trust. What begins as the story of a struggling young couple slowly transforms into an exhausting battle, fueled by insecurity, misunderstandings, and wounded pride. The story follows novelist Bill Austen, an aspiring writer who finally tastes success after years of rejection. His unexpected literary breakthrough brings fame and financial security, but it also changes the balance of his marriage. While Bill enjoys the attention of publishers, critics, and attractive admirers, his wife Bertie begins building a successful career of her own in the fashion world. Instead of celebrating each other's achievements, both spouses become consumed by suspicion. Every business meeting, late-night phone call, and friendly conversation becomes another reason to question the other's loyalty, pushing their once loving relationship dangerously close to collapse. One of the movie's most memorable scenes takes place backstage during a glamorous fashion show. Bertie prepares for an important modeling assignment while photographers crowd around the dressing rooms. Bill secretly slips inside, convinced she is hiding an affair with her influential employer. Their confrontation quickly escalates into a heated argument as accusations fly across the room. The surrounding mirrors reflect their growing emotional distance, turning what should have been an intimate conversation into a painful public spectacle. Although Janet Leigh delivers a heartfelt performance, the scene feels more uncomfortable than emotionally satisfying. Number 10. Toys in the Attic, 1963. Some Broadway plays thrive because of their intimate settings and emotionally charged performances, but translating that same intensity to the big screen is never easy. Toys in the Attic attempted exactly that, bringing Lillian Hellman's acclaimed stage drama to cinemas with an outstanding cast led by Dean Martin, Geraldine Page, Wendy Hiller, and Yvette Mimieux. While critics admired the performances, general audiences found the film overwhelmingly bleak, making it one of the year's biggest commercial disappointments. Set in the humid streets of New Orleans, the story revolves around Julian Bernier, a charming but irresponsible dreamer who unexpectedly returns home after years away with a mysterious fortune and a beautiful young bride named Lily. His sudden wealth immediately raises suspicions among his two unmarried sisters, Carrie and Anna, who have spent years sacrificing their own happiness while caring for their reckless brother. As whispers about Julian's questionable business dealings begin circulating through the neighborhood, long-hidden resentments, jealousy, and forbidden emotions slowly surface, tearing the fragile family apart. The film reaches its emotional high point during an unforgettable breakdown by Carrie, portrayed brilliantly by Geraldine Page. After realizing that Julian's marriage has permanently changed the family she desperately tried to preserve, Carrie retreats to her bedroom in complete emotional collapse. She tears photographs from the walls, rips curtains from the windows, smashes mirrors, and sobs uncontrollably, while years of suppressed frustration finally explode. The camera remains close to her face, capturing every painful expression, and making the audience witness the devastating consequences of obsession and loneliness. Although the performances received widespread praise, many viewers found the relentless emotional suffering exhausting. There were few moments of relief, humor, or optimism to balance the heavy drama. Critics admired the acting, but acknowledged that the film's stage origins often made it feel confined and dialogue-heavy. Audiences stayed away, and Toys in the Attic quietly faded from theaters, proving that exceptional performances alone could not overcome an overwhelmingly dark story during Hollywood's troubled year of 1963. Number 9. Under the Yum Yum Tree, 1963. By 1963, Jack Lemmon had become one of Hollywood's most dependable comedy stars, famous for playing lovable everymen, caught in ridiculous situations. Audiences expected another charming performance when Under the Yum Yum Tree arrived in theaters. Instead, they encountered a comedy built around a premise that many viewers found uncomfortable, even by the standards of the early 1960s. Although the film tried to present itself as a lighthearted romantic farce, its outdated humor and questionable behavior prevented it from becoming the crowd-pleaser the studio had hoped for. The story centers on Hogan, a carefree bachelor who owns an apartment building and proudly enjoys his reputation as a charming ladies' man. Secret peepholes hidden throughout the building allow him to spy on his female tenants, a habit he treats as harmless entertainment. His carefree lifestyle changes dramatically when an attractive young tenant named Robin moves into the building with her fiancé. Unlike the women Hogan has pursued before, Robin believes firmly in waiting until marriage before becoming intimate. Fascinated by her innocence and determination, Hogan unexpectedly falls in love and begins trying to transform himself into the respectable gentleman he believes she deserves. One of the movie's funniest sequences occurs when Hogan attempts another round of secret spying from the fire escape outside Robin's apartment. Leaning too far toward the window with a pair of binoculars, he loses his balance and desperately clings to the narrow ledge. As startled neighbors watch from below, he crashes through a clothesline before tumbling into a large metal dumpster with an enormous clang. The slapstick timing showcases Lemmon's remarkable physical comedy skills, even if the circumstances surrounding the scene feel increasingly awkward. Number 8. Critics' Choice, 1963. During the golden age of Hollywood comedy, few names carried as much weight as Bob Hope. His lightning-fast one-liners, effortless charm, and unmatched timing had entertained audiences for decades. Naturally, expectations were high when Critics' Choice reached theaters in 1963. Based on the successful Broadway play, the film promised a witty battle of egos inside New York's theatrical world. Instead, it delivered a talk-heavy comedy that struggled to escape its stage origins, leaving many moviegoers disappointed despite Hope's dependable performance. The story follows Parker Ballantine, one of New York's most respected theater critics. Parker has built his reputation on brutal honesty, believing that every production deserves an objective review, regardless of personal relationships. His carefully ordered life is thrown into chaos when his loving wife Angela secretly writes her own Broadway play. After producers unexpectedly agree to stage it, Parker realizes he faces an impossible dilemma. If he praises the production simply because his wife wrote it, he sacrifices the professional integrity that defines his career. If he criticizes it honestly, he risks destroying both Angela's confidence and their marriage. One of the film's funniest moments arrives when Angela proudly hands Parker the completed manuscript and eagerly waits for his opinion. Terrified of reading a play he suspects is terrible, Parker invents excuse after excuse to avoid opening the script. He quietly slips out the front door, sneaks through the backyard, and even climbs through a window hoping to escape the conversation. Bob Hope's expressive facial reactions and perfectly timed physical comedy create one of the movie's rare laugh-out-loud sequences, reminding audiences why he remained one of Hollywood's greatest comedians. Number 7. The Man from the Diners Club, 1963. By the early 1960s, Danny Kaye remained one of Hollywood's most gifted entertainers, celebrated for his rapid-fire dialogue, infectious energy, and remarkable talent for physical comedy. Hoping to modernize his image, MGM cast him in The Man from the Diners Club, a fast-paced comedy built around America's growing fascination with credit cards and consumer culture. The premise sounded fresh, but the execution relied on outdated slapstick that many audiences believed belonged to an earlier era. Instead of launching a new chapter in Kaye's career, the film became one of the year's biggest comedic disappointments. The story follows Ernest Clank, a kind-hearted but hopelessly clumsy employee working for the prestigious Diners Club. His quiet office routine suddenly turns into a nightmare after he accidentally approves a credit card application for a dangerous international gangster. When company executives discover the mistake, Ernest is ordered to recover the card before the criminal uses it to finance his operations. Forced into an undercover mission completely beyond his abilities, Ernest stumbles through luxury hotels, elegant restaurants, casinos, and exclusive clubs while desperately trying to outsmart hardened criminals who barely notice his presence. The movie's funniest sequence unfolds inside an upscale restaurant where Ernest disguises himself as a waiter to get close to the gangster's table. Determined to remain unnoticed, he instead creates absolute chaos. He spills steaming soup onto wealthy diners, drops towering trays filled with expensive meals, tangles himself in tablecloths, and accidentally sends crystal glasses crashing across the dining room floor. Danny Kaye's extraordinary physical timing keeps the scene entertaining, but the repetitive gags continue far longer than necessary, reducing genuine laughter to predictable routine. Number 6. The Cardinal, 1963. In the early 1960s, epic dramas filled with historical events and moral conflicts were considered prestigious Oscar contenders, and few directors embraced that formula more confidently than Otto Preminger. With The Cardinal, he set out to create a sweeping portrait of faith, sacrifice, and political upheaval spanning several decades. Featuring an impressive international cast and lavish production values, the film looked destined for greatness. Instead, its enormous running time and relentlessly serious tone tested audiences' patience, preventing it from becoming the blockbuster its studio expected. The story follows Stephen Formoyle, an idealistic young priest whose unwavering devotion to the Catholic Church gradually elevates him through its highest ranks. Along the way, he faces deeply personal challenges that force him to question the balance between religious duty and human compassion. He must confront his sister's unplanned pregnancy, minister to impoverished communities struggling with discrimination in the American South, and later witness the terrifying rise of Nazi influence in Europe. Each chapter places Stephen in situations where every decision carries enormous spiritual and emotional consequences. One of the film's most powerful scenes unfolds inside a church basement during a community gathering in the segregated South. As racial tensions erupt into violence, an enraged extremist attempts to incite a mob against local parishioners. Refusing to stand by, Stephen physically confronts the agitator, and the peaceful meeting suddenly descends into a brutal struggle. The sequence is surprisingly intense, contrasting the sacred surroundings with raw human anger, while illustrating the priest's willingness to risk everything for justice, rather than simply preach about it. Number 5. The VIPs, 1963. With Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton dominating newspaper headlines because of their highly publicized real-life romance during the filming of Cleopatra, MGM believed audiences would eagerly pay to see the pair reunited on screen. That idea became The VIPs, an all-star drama set almost entirely inside the luxurious VIP lounge of London's Heathrow Airport. On paper, it looked like the perfect prestige picture. It featured glamorous international stars, expensive sets, and multiple intertwining storylines. Yet despite the remarkable cast, the film struggled to justify its lavish production costs, and ultimately failed to become the runaway success the studio desperately wanted. The story begins when a dense blanket of fog grounds every international flight leaving London. Wealthy passengers suddenly find themselves trapped together inside the exclusive airport lounge, each carrying personal secrets that can no longer be avoided. Elizabeth Taylor portrays Frances Andros, a glamorous woman preparing to leave her emotionally distant millionaire husband forever. Richard Burton plays the charming man waiting to begin a new life with her. Around them, other travelers wrestle with equally dramatic crises. A struggling businessman fights to save his company from financial collapse. A famous actress questions her fading career, and a young couple worries their relationship may not survive another disappointment. As the hours pass, the airport becomes less of a travel terminal and more of an emotional pressure cooker, where every conversation changes someone's future. The film's emotional centerpiece arrives when Frances finally confronts her husband inside the elegant lounge. Years of resentment explode into an unforgettable argument as she tears apart her travel documents, throws expensive jewelry onto the floor, and breaks down in tears while Burton's character desperately tries to comfort her. Taylor commands the screen with remarkable emotional intensity, turning what could have been an ordinary melodramatic confrontation into one of the movie's strongest performances. Number 4. The Leopard, 1963. Lavish historical epics dominated international cinema during the early 1960s, and few productions were more ambitious than The Leopard. Directed by the legendary Luchino Visconti, and adapted from Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa's celebrated novel. The film was praised for its breathtaking visuals, extraordinary attention to historical detail, and remarkable performances. However, despite earning critical acclaim in Europe, it struggled to connect with mainstream American audiences. Its deliberate pacing, lengthy running time, and thoughtful exploration of political change proved too demanding for viewers expecting the excitement of a traditional Hollywood epic. Set during the unification of Italy in the 1860s, the story follows Prince Don Fabrizio Salina, portrayed magnificently by Burt Lancaster. As revolutionary forces reshape Sicily, the prince slowly realizes that the aristocratic world his family has ruled for generations is disappearing forever. While he accepts the inevitable decline of the old nobility with quiet dignity, his ambitious nephew Tancredi embraces the changing times. Recognizing that survival depends upon adaptation rather than tradition, Tancredi chooses to marry Angelica, the beautiful daughter of a wealthy middle-class family, whose fortune represents the future of Italy rather than its past. Their relationship symbolizes an entirely new social order, replacing centuries of inherited privilege. The film's most unforgettable sequence is the legendary ballroom scene that occupies nearly the final 45 minutes. Inside an opulent palace, illuminated by hundreds of glowing chandeliers, elegantly dressed nobles glide across polished marble floors as orchestras perform magnificent waltzes. Visconti's camera gracefully follows dancers through lavish rooms overflowing with gold decorations, crystal mirrors, and priceless artwork. Amid the celebration, Prince Salina quietly wanders through the palace, observing smiling faces while realizing he no longer belongs to the world surrounding him. His silent reflections transform an extravagant dance into a deeply emotional farewell to an entire era of European history. Number 3. The Ugly American, 1963. Few actors commanded more respect in the early 1960s than Marlon Brando. Every new performance was treated as a major cinematic event, and The Ugly American appeared to offer him another prestigious role filled with political complexity and moral conflict. Based on the best-selling novel by Eugene Burdick and William Lederer, the film attempted to explore the growing tensions of the Cold War in Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, its serious subject matter and uncompromising message proved difficult to sell to audiences seeking entertainment rather than political debate, turning an ambitious production into one of the year's biggest commercial disappointments. Brando stars as Harrison Carter McWhite, an intelligent but idealistic American ambassador assigned to the fictional nation of Sarkhan. Upon arriving, he discovers a country balancing on the edge of revolution. Communist insurgents steadily gain influence while corrupt politicians and competing foreign interests manipulate ordinary citizens for their own benefit. Unlike many government officials around him, McWhite genuinely believes diplomacy, education, and infrastructure can improve people's lives. He visits remote villages, speaks directly with local families, and works tirelessly to build trust instead of relying on military intimidation. However, every step forward is undermined by arrogant intelligence officers, political interference, and growing violence that threatens to consume the nation. One of the film's most powerful scenes occurs after McWhite visits a rural village where American-funded construction projects were supposed to symbolize hope. Instead, he finds burned homes, frightened civilians, and heartbreaking evidence that political promises have failed the very people they were meant to protect. As smoke rises in the background, Brando silently surveys the destruction, realizing that his carefully planned diplomatic mission is collapsing before his eyes. The restrained performance communicates despair far more effectively than any speech could. Number 2. 5 Days at Peking, 1963. Only a few months before Cleopatra became Hollywood's most infamous financial headache, another enormous historical epic was already draining studio resources. 55 Days at Peking arrived with every ingredient of a blockbuster. Charlton Heston, Ava Gardner, David Niven, breathtaking sets, thousands of extras, and one of the largest production budgets of its era. Producer Samuel Bronston believed audiences would once again embrace grand-scale historical spectacles. Instead, the film became one of the costliest disappointments of 1963, pushing Bronston's empire dangerously close to financial collapse. The story recreates the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, when anti-foreign nationalist forces surrounded the diplomatic quarter of Peking, trapping representatives from several nations inside the heavily fortified compound. Charlton Heston portrays Major Matt Lewis, an experienced American officer who joins British diplomat Sir Arthur Robertson, played by David Niven, in organizing the desperate defense. As food supplies disappear and enemy attacks grow more relentless each day, soldiers and civilians alike struggle to maintain hope. Alongside the military conflict, The film introduces a romance between Major Lewis and Baroness Natalie Ivanov, portrayed by Ava Gardner, adding personal drama to the larger historical crisis. The movie's most spectacular sequence depicts the full-scale assault on the foreign legations. Thousands of Boxer rebels charge through smoke-filled streets, while cannons thunder, buildings erupt into flames, and defenders desperately fire from makeshift barricades. The enormous practical explosions, cavalry charges, and carefully choreographed battle scenes remain visually impressive even today. Every frame reflects the extraordinary amount of money invested in the production, creating one of the most ambitious war spectacles of the decade. Number 1. Cleopatra, 1963. No discussion of Hollywood's greatest financial disasters can begin anywhere, except with Cleopatra. Before a single audience bought a ticket, the production had already become the most expensive and controversial movie ever attempted. 20th Century Fox envisioned a spectacular historical epic that would redefine filmmaking for generations. Instead, endless delays, serious health problems, changing directors, and an exploding budget transformed the production into a nightmare. What started as a film expected to cost just a few $1,000,000 eventually ballooned to an astonishing $44 million, a figure almost unimaginable in 1963. Every headline surrounding the movie became bigger than the movie itself, especially after Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's real-life romance dominated newspapers around the world. The film tells the story of Cleopatra VII, the brilliant queen of Egypt, as she fights to preserve her kingdom during Rome's relentless expansion. First forming an alliance with Julius Caesar and later falling passionately in love with Mark Antony, Cleopatra attempts to navigate betrayal, political ambition, and devastating war while protecting Egypt's independence. Rather than portraying her as merely a seductive ruler, the film presents her as a determined strategist whose intelligence equals that of the powerful Roman leaders surrounding her. The movie's most unforgettable scene remains Cleopatra's breathtaking entrance into Rome. Hundreds of elaborately dressed servants escort an enormous golden sphinx through cheering crowds as Elizabeth Taylor appears wearing an extravagant jewel-covered gown and towering headdress. The sheer scale of the sequence is staggering. Massive sets, thousands of extras, exotic animals, ornate costumes, and spectacular pageantry fill every frame, creating one of the most expensive scenes ever filmed at the time. Later, equally ambitious battle sequences, luxurious palace interiors, and emotionally charged confrontations between Cleopatra, Caesar, and Antony continue to demonstrate the extraordinary craftsmanship invested in the production. So, did 1963 nearly destroy Hollywood, or did it force the industry to reinvent itself? Looking back, these unforgettable box office disasters proved that enormous budgets, legendary stars, and spectacular sets could never guarantee success. Some of these films eventually found new appreciation from critics and movie lovers, while others remain fascinating reminders of how quickly even the biggest studios can lose millions. One thing is certain, 1963 changed Hollywood forever. If you enjoyed this countdown, be sure to like the video, subscribe for more classic movie deep dives, and let us know in the comments which of these forgotten disasters deserves a second chance. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.